Hello, and welcome to the first official episode of Book Dragon in the Iron Temple. Today I'm going to be doing a quick wrap up of my spooky season reads, uh, mostly read during the month of October. So every year I get pretty hyped actually about planning my October spooky reading. Often I'll plan it like months in advance and get it's kind of like the anticipation and excitement building up for it. So usually I kind of read a mix of gothic fiction, ghost stories, and just general horror, and a bit of mystery as well. Um, this year's reads were a mix of modern gothic horror, classic gothic fiction, some pulp horror, which was a lot of fun, golden age mystery, and one Georgian romance, which might seem out of place, but the theme fits, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I should also mention that the list isn't really a true monthly roundup because I finished one fantasy book in early October that carried over from September. Book carried over from September was actually this one here. So Limits of Power by Elizabeth Moon, and this is actually the fourth book in the Paladin's Legacy series, which is the most recent subseries of her larger Paxenarian series or Pax World. I'm not sure if there's an official title for that one, but I won't talk about this one in this video because I'll probably do after I finish the last Paladin's Legacy book. I'll probably kind of do kind of a summary or uh, discussion, I guess, of the whole series, including the trilogy, Deed of Paxenarian, and the Legacy of Gerd and Paladin's Legacy. So the first October kind of spooky read book that I read this year was pretty popular one that people have probably heard about already. Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. Again, this one is it's been pretty popular since it was published, so I imagine most people have probably read it, or not read it, sorry, have probably heard about it. And this one I rated 4 out of 5 stars. Um, so essentially, this is a tribute to Henry James's Turn of the Screw. It isn't really meant to be a retelling so much as, again, just a tribute. It does, though, share some subtle similarities with the Turn of the Screw. It features a protagonist who is a governess. In our kind of modern language, it would be an opath. Um, yeah, and she's caring for young children. She's hired under kind of suspiciously generous conditions or terms to care for 3 children in a large mansion that is located in rural Scotland. So what I really liked about this book was it kind of blended traditional Gothic horror and that kind of fear of supernatural haunting and those kind of lurking unseen eyes that are always just out of sight with a modern day smart technology and surveillance culture. So I thought the two were blended together really well, and that's really what drew me into this book in particular. So the mansion in The Turn of the Key really plays on that. It's kind of an unsettling or jarring mashup of a beautiful Victorian mansion that's been renovated and kind of blended with this kind of garish modern smart home. So even the character is commenting about how she goes from one room to the other, and it's like, yeah, it's a very jarring transition from one spot in the house to the or one portion of the house to the next. So basically, the entire house is wired with surveillance cameras and kind of high tech nanny cams, and even in private bedrooms, which builds that sense of that unsettling unseen eyes in this case of technology. But it really matches that gothic atmosphere quite well, I thought. The mystery itself was one that I think I had guessed around the midway point, maybe a bit after, I can't quite recall, but it still kept me riveted to the book, to be honest. I've seen some complaints online, for example, that some people found the protagonist to be really annoying, or it was kind of her narrative style uh, that annoyed people. Um, but I can't say for me that I really found her annoying. There was always something a little bit odd about her, but I think it was in a way that was really necessary to the story. And it's kind of that annoying that needs to be annoying, I guess. You can kind of see that in the decision making of her character and the kind of choices that she makes that at first really make no sense, and you wonder, like, what are what are you doing? But it all reveals itself in the end. In the end, though, I actually did quite like her character and the way her character was written. I think that part of that is because certain aspects of her personality played a little bit with that of the governess from A Turn of the Screw. And there's also aspects of even the middle two children that she's caring for, as well as the actual conclusion itself, that really played with aspects of Henry James's work and in the varying ways that that original conclusion can be interpreted. Yeah, that was The Turn of the Key, and I do recommend it if you like modern Gothic horror generally. The next book that I read was Weird Tales Volume 1, and it's edited by Peter Haining. So this is basically a collection of short stories from the 1930s editions of Weird Tales magazine. It wasn't one of the best short story collections that I've read, but it was a lot of fun. There are definitely some gems in here too, that I really enjoyed. I would say that there were 2 or 3 stories that for me featured what I would call racism beyond what was even commonly portrayed in most fiction back then, and for that time period. For example, Black Hound of Death was a story that I could have otherwise really loved. Robert E. Howard is really talented at describing great combat scenes, great action scenes, but there were just certain things that I couldn't personally ignore, just with the level of racism in that story. But as far as the full list of authors and stories that are featured, we have The Man Who Returned by Edmund Hamilton, which was in the February 1934 edition. Black Hound of Death by Robert E. Howard from November 1936. The Shuttered House by August W. Derleth, April 1937. Frozen Beauty by Seabury Queen, February 1938. Haunting Columns by Robert E. Howard as well, February 1938. This one is a poem. Beyond the Walls of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft, from March 1938. The Garden of Adamfa by Clark Ashton Smith, April 1938 as well. Cordelia's Song by Vincent Starrett, April 1938, and this one was actually a poem as well. Beyond the Phoenix by Henry Kuttner, October 1938. This one was a lot of fun. The Black Monk by G.G. Pendarvis, October 1938. And that is, I'm trying to remember what her, because this is actually a pen name for this author, and I'm trying to remember what her real name actually was. But anyways, The Passing of a God by Henry S. Whitehead, December 1938, and They Run Again by Leah Bodine Drake, December 1938. And that was actually another poem, but it was a lot of fun. It was a poem about werewolves. So I enjoyed that one. So when it came to my favorite stories and Weird Tales Volume 1, that would probably be The Man Who Returned by Edmund Hamilton, which was the first story of the book. I really liked that story. I kind of went into it thinking it would be kind of uninteresting, I guess, just based on what the assumptions I made about it. Especially kind of those stories where someone, wakes up in their own coffin. They've been mistaken for dead for whatever reason. But this one, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was interesting, and I actually felt myself really sympathizing with the character and kind of the things that are revealed to him. Yeah, I would read more by Edmund Hamilton. There was also, after that, a pretty cool kind of weird science story called Frozen Beauty. It had me laughing out loud almost the entire time. Just yeah, just with the language that Quinn uses, and then that kind of Hercule Poirot sort of detective inspired figure. It was really funny. It was a lot of fun to read. Yeah, I would recommend it for sure, and I'd read more in that series of stories of his. Next was that I really liked was Beyond the Wells of Sleep by Lovecraft. Of course, with Lovecraft, there's always going to be problems. In this case, he kind of just rails on for a while about kind of white trash, for example, but the ending really captured my imagination. Yeah, I just found there was something really enthralling about it that I enjoyed. I also liked the story after that, The Garden of Adamfa, which I found really unsettling in a sort of graphic sense or kind of a gory sense in a way. I think there's a certain type of gore that I associate with pre 1950s horror. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but it's a certain, I guess it's kind of like a certain gut feeling that I get reading that type of more graphic horror from that period. I remember as a kid, for example, my grandmother sometimes read me some stories from 1001 Nights, and I especially remember, as I'm sure a lot of people do, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. There was something about the descriptions in this and that kind of, yeah, uh, I'm not sure if you'd call it gore, but yeah, there was something that kind of gave me that same feeling I had in my childhood. Um, that kind of reminded me of those folktales and especially that particular story. So yeah, I'm kind of interested again to read more from that author as well. And then the other story that I really, really loved in this book, well, maybe not loved, but I really enjoyed it, was Beyond the Phoenix by Henry Kuttner, which I never actually read any Elec of Atlantis stories, but I really intend to now in the future. This was really entertaining sword and sorcery, and it made me realize I've been missing that kind of in my life, so I'm definitely going to check out more Elec of Atlantis stories in the future. So yeah, I rated this whole collection 3 out of 5 stars. Again, it wasn't the best short story compilation I've read, but I enjoyed it a fair bit. The next one after that is actually uh, a bit different. It's the Georgian romance I was referring to before, which is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So again, you might ask, why include this in Spooky Reading Month? And yeah, Northanger Abbey is definitely not a scary or unsettling book in any way whatsoever. But as you might know, Austen spoofed several Gothic novels throughout this book, some of those being some of my favorites, like The Mysteries of Udolpho, um, in a way that kind of is sort of a friendly poking, making fun of certain Gothic tropes, Gothic heroines. Um, I found this book actually really, really fast paced and really hilarious, if I'm honest too. I had a really great time with it. Um, at some points, it's the heroine, I guess we'll say, was a very frustrating person, but not in a way that made me hate the book. But definitely made me very passionate about it while I was reading it. Um, so yeah, it was a lot of fun and very funny. And it's kind of weird because I'm not usually someone who enjoys romance novels or even romantic subplots in a lot of the books that I read. Usually those aren't really my favorite things. And in some cases, I might try to avoid them if I know that a book is very heavy on romance. But my only exception to that is 18th and 19th century Gothic novels that feature romances or just straight up Georgian or Victorian romances. I just find them a hell of a lot of fun and I get a good laugh out of them. And I just love the drama of it all and the language it's used. Yeah. So after Northanger Abbey, I read some pulp horror. Namely, this one is a 1970s novella called Hound of Frankenstein, and it's written by Peter Tremaine. I rated this 3.75 out of 5 stars. But it was really, really close to being 4 stars for me. It was great fun. Um, so it was a bit of a tribute to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and in some ways kind of continues the stories, but I can't really go too much into it without spoiling it, so I'll kind of, yeah, stop there as far as explanations. But it takes place on the Cornish moors, and it really builds up that chilling atmosphere, but also kind of cozy atmosphere as well. It also takes place on All Hallows Eve and the days surrounding All Hallows Eve, so it was very fitting thematically speaking. There was also some solid characters that I really enjoyed a lot as well, and the basic premise, again without giving too much away, is that a doctor moves to a small village um, to take up a new practice. But before he can really get started in that, actually even before he even arrives, crises unfold, and he decides to boldly adventure out and to solve the problem, save the day, despite the village's superstitions around All Hallows Eve and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I gave this 3.75 out of 5 stars and enjoyed it a fair bit. So after that, I went for another classic with the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So this one I rated 4.5 out of 5 stars. So this is a book that I remember that I read in high school and that I really liked, but somehow completely forgot entirely what it was about. So at some point I actually thought I remembered it involving like a haunting or something like that, but clearly not. I really enjoyed this regardless though, and regardless of my that incorrect impression that I had. But yeah, 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was a very good read for me. And the book kind of incited a lot of different reactions from me. Early on, I found the themes and the discussions that were taking place really weighed on me in kind of a really depressing way, but also in that kind of cathartic, depressing way. And that's probably because it matched a lot of my own anxieties. And then after that, of course, it switches gears for a bit. We get a lot more humor, especially with Lord Henry's social commentary, which I got a good laugh out of myself. And then, of course, we get some periods of higher action as well. But in general, I really liked kind of the, I guess, pensive tone to it. And I think the themes really resonated with me, made me think a lot, both while reading it afterwards. Themes around aging, the desire for eternal youth, and this annihilation of the past as like the extreme extension of that. And then themes around, for example, hedonism and the value of pleasure, character and integrity, self-absorption, and the stories that people tell to justify their actions or make themselves feel as though they're not the villain in their own story or in other people's stories. Yeah, which kind of ties in with that self-absorption and not being able to see people as individuals outside of their impact or their role in your own life or your own narrative. So yeah, I enjoyed this quite a bit. And I definitely found myself, I was taking a lot of notes while I was reading this. And yeah, thought a lot about it, and it really stuck with me afterwards. And having now reread this, I'm actually kind of surprised that I apparently forgot what this was entirely about, just because it has left such a strong impression for me. So yeah, that's the Picture of Dorian Gray. So the next book is kind of a total shift away from Dorian Gray, but I still enjoyed it, and that is Dead Voices by Katherine Arden. Katherine Arden, of course, you might recognize as the author of the excellent, in my opinion, Winternight trilogy that was recently concluded with Winter of the Witch, which, yeah, that was an amazing conclusion to that series, I thought. If you haven't read those, which I know many people probably have by this point, I definitely recommend them. Arden's prose as well, especially when it comes to her landscape descriptions and natural descriptions, is among my favorite modern fiction and in modern fantasy in general. Yeah, I really love it. Anyway, so Dead Voices is actually the second book in her Small Spaces series, which is actually a children's horror series. and I actually rated this 4 to 5 stars. Per se, I don't really read children's fiction at all, um, pretty much except for like occasionally rereading Redwall books, which were childhood favorites for me. But I have to say that I really enjoyed this book and just this series in general, which there's 2 books in it so far. So there's going to be actually 4 books in this kids horror series, and each one takes place during one of the 4 seasons. So the first one was in fall, this one is in winter, as you can tell from the cover. And then, of course, I imagine the next will be in spring and so on. So the first book took place in October near Halloween, and I found her character work in that one was actually really well done and something I really kind of appreciated reading. But the thing I liked most about that first one was actually her prose, and I feel like she did just a very good job of bringing the strengths of her prose from Winter Night Trilogy and applying it in a way that's accessible to children. So not really watering it down in a sense, but just tuning it so that to just apply it to that children's or sorry that particular audience. It did really well at building this kind of really beautiful autumnal atmosphere, despite that it wasn't actually particularly scary from an adult perspective, but I guess it depends what scares you and that kind of thing. It's going to be different for all of us. But Dead Voices wound up being a bit the reverse for me, especially given that her breathtaking, totally breathtaking wintry prose in Winter Night Trilogy was amazing, and I was actually surprised that she didn't really harness that, I felt, in the second book. On the other hand, I'm really a big sucker for a good ghost story, and this one was definitely more spine-tingling to me than that first book, because it is a ghost story. So the book features 3 main characters, Olivia, Coco, and Brian, and then where the first book focused more on Olivia's character, this book followed more Coco and kind of allowed her to shine and build herself up more. And one of the things I enjoy about these books too is kind of, well, they're very heartwarming in a lot of ways, even though they are meant to be horror. They do kind of have that heartwarming aspect to them. And they also, I think, deal with a lot of important themes for kids who are age 8 to 12. For example, Olivia dealing with the grief around her mother's death and some very real emotions that are related to, how adults, her peers, treat her as kind of like the kid with the dead mother, and just her complicated feelings around that loss in general. And then in Coco's case, we see her slowly grow more self-reliant and kind of define the assumptions others are making of her as the books go on. So yeah, I would recommend this to kids, probably late elementary to middle school age. Or if, like me, you're a big fan of Catherine Arden's writing and the Winter Night Trilogy, I think you might enjoy these as well. So after that, we have a Poirot mystery called The Halloween Party. I chose this for obvious reasons, perhaps. The cover had an awesome Halloween aesthetic, plus I love mysteries, so a seasonal Agatha Christie seemed very perfect. Alas, this book didn't really carry the Halloween theme really beyond the first few chapters, so that was a bit disappointing. But those early chapters were pretty glorious and hilarious. I rated it at the end 3.25 out of 5 stars. I know different people's 3-star ratings mean different things. Some people seem to see it as a bad rating. For me, anything in that 3-star vicinity still means that I thought it was a good book, and that I enjoyed reading it quite a bit. So that was the case with this. I did like it. It just wasn't a favorite or something that I was as excited as I would be compared to like a 4 or 5-star book. Anyway, Mrs. Oliver's dialogue in the early chapters was definitely up my alley as far as humor goes. And again, I was just laughing out loud throughout those early chapters, even with Poirot's early dialogue too. And then they also kind of introduced to me, which another positive of this is this intriguing British tradition apparently called Snapdragon. It's so apparently one puts brandy in a bowl with raisin and then lights it on fire. Um, the revelers proceed to try to pluck out the flaming raisins and extinguish the flames by eating the raisins. So I wouldn't try this in my home for obvious fire safety reasons, but I can't lie, I was intrigued. I might actually propose trying it next time we go camping because it sounds straight up bonkers and it could well be a good time. I don't know. We'll see. Anyways, soon after all these shenanigans, Poirot starts to investigate the murder that happens at that Halloween party. And then the story starts to slow down a little bit as he investigates that. Probably more than you'd usually expect from an Agatha Christie novel. But actually, this was a mystery that I did enjoy trying to figure out. I'm not sure if this is a spoiler or not, so be aware if you're somebody who considers any info, even if it's not revealing the conclusion, to be a kind of spoiler material. So warning, warning. Um, but basically, I realized that I figured out at least part of the mystery around the halfway point. But some of Agatha Christie's usual trickery had me self-doubting until the end because I was having kind of trouble piecing or kind of making those pieces that I had figured out fit into other bits of information that she provides. So yeah, she was tricky. Um, so it might be slower than normal for her, but it's still a fun mystery to solve as far as I'm concerned. So after that, I dove into my very last book of the spooky season, which was Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. So wow, this was an amazing gothic mystery. The character work was absolutely phenomenal as far as I'm concerned. The plot was very, very well layered. It was just one thing after the other that always kept you thinking and guessing. And then the pacing was also excellent. To put this in perspective, this book was basically 700 pages, quite thick. Um, but it moved at a very, very fast pace. Um, and it was never particularly slow. It just kind of kept that up at a good clip. And it was very difficult to put down, at least from my perspective. Um, it is multi POV, featuring a number of different narratives, providing kind of different pieces of information used to pull all of the final evidence together to prove the case. And you don't fully know what the case is until, of course, you've read into it for a bit, so I won't reveal too much about that. I also have to say that, especially for a novel written in 1859, um, this is one of the best, I think, female characters I've ever read in Victorian literature. It was Marion Halcombe was written very, very well. Um, and there was also a very, very interesting villain as well, um, who, yeah, not what you would expect, very, very um, kind of multi-layered and kind of a villain that, I mean, I know people kind of talk about villains who, you like despite their villainy, but with this, I think this is one of those villains that like it was exceptional in that sense that like you really did like him and you couldn't help but like him despite everything that he was doing. So and actually I think the relationship, which wasn't a romantic relationship, and the dynamic between those two characters, um, Marion and the Count, was especially compelling. Just their back and forth at one point, especially during Marion's POV section or narrative section, was just, yeah, riveting. It's hard to reveal too much more about the plot without giving spoilers, but genre-wise, I would call this gothic mystery. It doesn't have concrete supernatural elements, so I wouldn't go in expecting a ghost story. I know that's sometimes a misconception that can happen. And then in my edition, there is an afterword or essay at the very end of the book that went kind of further into Collins' approach to characterization and why it was so strong and why it's recognized as being so strong. That was also an interesting read. It also gave a little bit more supplementary information about Wilkie Collins himself. So yeah, I highly recommend this to mystery lovers. I rated it finally as 4.25 out of 5 stars. Great book. Anyway, that is it for this episode, and thanks for watching. Feel free to comment if you've read any of these books or are interested in them in any way. And if you made it through the video and enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.